Ploiești, Romania. August 1, 1943. Lieutenant John Palm gripped the controls of his B-24 Liberator, brewery wagon, as it screamed across Romanian farmland at 200 feet. The four Pratt & Whitney engines roared at full power, pushing the massive bomber through air thick with smoke and tracer fire. Behind him, navigator William Wright slumped over his charts, mortally wounded by a direct flak hit to the nose. Bombardier Robert Merrill was already dead. One engine was destroyed, two more coughing and sputtering, trailing smoke. Ahead, the refineries of Ploiești burned like a vision of hell itself. Palm looked down at his right foot. It wasn't there anymore. A 20mm cannon shell from Hauptmann Wilhelm Steinmann's Messerschmitt Bf-109 had blown it clean off the rudder pedal moments earlier. Blood soaked his flight suit. The pain was extraordinary, but adrenaline kept him conscious, kept him fighting the controls. He'd reached down to check why the right rudder wasn't responding properly. That's when he'd discovered his leg was nearly severed below the knee. This wasn't how heavy bombers were supposed to fight. The B-24 had been designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, cruising at 25,000 feet where the air was thin and German fighters struggled to intercept. Palm's bomber weighed 65,000 pounds fully loaded. It was 66 feet long, with a wingspan of 110 feet. The control surfaces required constant muscle to manage in formation. Pilots joked it flew like a loaded truck, demanding respect and attention every moment. And here they were at altitudes where children could see the faces of American airmen through the plexiglass nose, where Messerschmitt Bf-109s could dive down and rake them with cannon fire before the gunners could even track them, where the bombers themselves were targets so large that Romanian anti-aircraft crews could hardly miss. The mission had sounded insane from the beginning. Send 178 B-24 Liberators on a 2,400-mile round trip from Libya to Romania. Fly without fighter escort because no fighters had the range. Approach the target at altitudes lower than some church steeples. Strike the refineries that supplied a third of all Axis oil in Europe, then somehow fly home through whatever the Luftwaffe and Romanian defenses threw at them. Before we continue with what happened over Ploiești, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the stories that reveal the human reality behind history's greatest conflicts. Every detail here is verified, every moment documented, because the men who fought deserve nothing less than the truth. Lieutenant Colonel John Kane, who commanded the 98th Bomb Group, had understood immediately what the mission meant. Ploiești wasn't just another target. It was the petroleum lifeline of Hitler's war machine. The refineries surrounding the Romanian city produced 60% of the crude oil for the Axis powers. 90-octane aviation fuel, the highest quality in Europe. Without Ploiești, German tanks would stop rolling, Luftwaffe fighters would be grounded, U-boats would sit idle in their pens. The Americans knew all this because they'd helped build the damn place. Before the war, American oil companies had invested heavily in Romanian petroleum. Standard Oil, Texaco, others had built and expanded the refineries. When war came, that knowledge remained. The Army Air Forces tracked down engineers who'd worked in Ploiești, oil executives who'd managed the refineries. They borrowed films from corporate archives, detailed photographs, technical specifications. They knew precisely which towers to hit, which cracking plants to destroy, which storage tanks held the most fuel. Intelligence had been so thorough that crews trained on a full-scale mock-up built in the Libyan desert. From July 20th onwards, the American crews started training for the missions, repeatedly flying practice flights over a reasonable mock-up of the oil installations constructed in the vicinity of Benghazi. They flew at 50 feet, learning to hold formation when buildings and trees blurred past their windows. They practiced jettisoning bombs with precise timing, understanding that at 200 feet, a delayed fuse was the difference between destroying a target and destroying yourself. The B-24 itself was a remarkable machine, though its crews had mixed feelings about it. Built by Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, it represented American mass production at its peak. Over 18,000 Liberators would be produced during the war, more than any other American military aircraft in history. Half of them came from Ford's Willow Run plant near Detroit, where assembly lines churned out B-24s using automobile manufacturing techniques. At peak production, Willow Run completed one bomber every 63 minutes. The aircraft's most distinctive feature was its Davis wing, a high-efficiency design that gave it greater range and speed than the B-17 Flying Fortress. The Liberator could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs and had a maximum range of 2,850 miles. It cruised at 175 miles per hour, maxed out at 303. 4 Pratt & Whitney 14-cylinder radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, provided the muscle. But the B-24 had its problems. It leaked fuel constantly. Crews flew with bomb bay doors slightly open to vent potentially explosive fumes that accumulated in the fuselage. The high-mounted Davis wing made ditching at sea treacherous. The aircraft tended to break apart on impact with water. And unlike the B-17, which could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying, the Liberator was less forgiving. Its fuel tanks were vulnerable. A well-placed burst of cannon fire could turn a B-24 into a fireball. The crew consisted of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, flight engineer, ball turret gunner, tail gunner, and 2 waist gunners. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in a well-glazed cockpit, bombardier and navigator positioned in the plexiglass nose below them. The radio operator worked just aft of the cockpit. The flight engineer managed the engines from his position near the top turret. Separating the forward and aft sections were twin bomb bays, connected only by a narrow catwalk about 9 inches wide. A man in full flight gear, wearing a parachute and carrying a machine gun, had to edge across this catwalk carefully. In an emergency, reaching the rear door meant navigating that precarious path while the aircraft bucked and rolled. The defensive armament consisted of 10 .50 caliber machine guns bristling from turrets and windows. A powered turret in the nose. Another on top of the fuselage. A retractable ball turret underneath, operated by the smallest crew member who squeezed into the cramped space without a parachute. 2 waist gunners stood amidships, firing from open windows. A tail gunner covered the rear. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute. In theory, a B-24 formation could put up a wall of lead that no fighter could penetrate. In theory. At 25,000 feet, flying in tight formation, the theory sometimes worked. But that's not what Operation Tidal Wave called for. The planners, led by Colonel Jacob Smart from General Arnold's staff, had conceived something revolutionary. A low-altitude mass attack, coming in fast and low to evade radar, hitting all targets simultaneously before defenses could react. The bombers would strike at 500 feet or less, drop delayed action bombs, and be gone before German fighters could scramble or anti-aircraft guns could track them effectively. The plan violated every principle of American strategic bombing doctrine. High-altitude attacks minimized vulnerability, allowed precision, gave crews a fighting chance to bail out if hit. Low altitude meant flying into ground fire, meant facing fighters with a reduced defensive envelope, meant certain death if you took a direct hit. But Ploesti was too important, too heavily defended for a conventional raid. Smart believed surprise and speed could overcome the dangers. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The crews began preparing in late June, when 3 groups from the 8th Air Force in England, the 44th, 93rd, and 389th, flew to Libya to join the 9th Air Force's 98th and 376 groups already stationed at Benghazi. The desert base was miserable. Dust storms, scorching heat, primitive facilities, dysentery running rampant through the ranks. Men slept in tents, ate canned rations, and tried to keep their aircraft operational in conditions that strained every system. The intensive training began. Low-level formation flying, something these crews had never practiced. High-altitude precision bombing was what they trained for, what Army Air Force doctrine emphasized. Now they were learning to fly heavy bombers at altitudes where a moment's inattention meant plowing into the ground. But they persisted. Every morning they took off and flew low over the Libyan desert, terrifying Arab farmers, blowing down tents, practicing the precise timing and positioning required. They added special bomb bay fuel tanks, increasing capacity to 3,100 gallons. They removed the Norden bomb sights and installed modified gun sights for low-level bombing. They loaded 500-pound and 1,000-pound high explosive bombs mixed with incendiaries, all fused with delayed actions ranging from 45 seconds to 6 hours. The intelligence briefings were exhaustive. Group commanders Kane, Wood, Timberlake, and Wing Commander Brigadier General Ent studied the targets until they knew them better than the crews themselves. In the evenings, they watched motion pictures of the target area, films provided by American oil companies who'd operated in Romania before the war. Engineers who'd actually helped build the refineries came and explained how the facilities worked, where they were most vulnerable, how best to destroy them. For 5 days, crews absorbed information, memorized target photographs, studied models, learned the approach routes. They were told the defenses would be manageable. Some anti-aircraft guns, yes, but manned by Romanians who would likely run for shelter when nearly 200 American bombers roared overhead. A few German fighters, but nothing like what they'd face over Germany itself. This assessment was dangerously wrong, and it would cost lives. The Germans knew Ploesti's importance as well as the Americans did. After a small raid in June 1942 by 13 B-24s, which caused minimal damage, Luftwaffe General Alfred Gerstenberg had been given authority to fortify Ploesti into one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. He'd built a masterpiece of integrated air defense. 230 anti-aircraft guns ringed the refineries. Not the modest numbers American intelligence suggested, but hundreds of weapons. 36 heavy 88mm batteries, supplemented by 37mm and 20mm guns concealed in haystacks, railroad cars, mock buildings. 15 Wurzburg radar installations provided fire control. The heavy batteries were manned by experienced German crews. The lighter weapons by Romanian troops who'd been training for over a year. Barrage balloons on steel cables forced aircraft to fly at specific altitudes. Smoke generators could blanket entire refineries in minutes. And the Luftwaffe had positioned fighters within range. 3 squadrons with over 200 aircraft. Bf-109GS, the latest models with powerful cannon armament. Bf-110 twin-engine fighters. Romanian IAR-80 fighters. All waiting. But the Americans didn't know this. Their intelligence was catastrophically inadequate. They believed they'd achieve surprise, strike before defenses could react, be gone before it mattered. On the morning of August 1, 1943, the 5 groups comprising the strike force began lifting off from their home airfields around Benghazi. Large amounts of dust kicked up during takeoff caused limited visibility and strained engines already carrying the burden of large bomb loads and additional fuel. These conditions contributed to the loss of 1 aircraft, Kickapoo, during takeoff, but 177 of the planned 178 aircraft departed safely. They formed up and headed north across the Mediterranean, a massive formation stretching for miles. The plan called for the 376th Liberators to lead, followed by the 93rd, 98th, 44th, and 389th groups. They would cross the Mediterranean and Adriatic, navigate through Albania and Yugoslavia, enter Romania from the south, then turn north toward Ploesti. 7 different target areas. Simultaneous strikes. Maximum destruction. It began falling apart almost immediately. Over the Mediterranean, aircraft number 28, Wongo Wongo, belonging to the 376 group and piloted by Lieutenant Brian Flavel, began to fly erratically before plunging into the sea due to an unexplained malfunction. Lieutenant Guy Iovine, a friend of Flavel who was piloting aircraft number 23, Desert Lily, descended from the formation to look for survivors, narrowly missing aircraft Brewery Wagon, piloted by Lieutenant Palm. Iovine circled the crash site but found no one. Unable to catch the formation now miles ahead and thousands of feet higher, he aborted the mission and returned to base. The formation continued. They crossed into German-controlled airspace, flying low over Greece and Albania, dodging mountains, maintaining radio silence. Romanian and Bulgarian border radar picked them up, but the low altitude created confusion about their numbers and destination. German fighters were scrambled but ordered to patrol at 16,000 feet, where high-altitude bombers were expected. Then came the catastrophic navigation error that sealed the mission's fate. Approaching the initial point near Targovist where the formation should turn northwest toward Ploesti, the lead navigator became disoriented. Instead of recognizing Targovist, he mistook a different town for the initial point. The 376th group, leading the entire formation, turned southeast toward Bucharest instead of northwest toward Ploesti. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, commanding the 93rd Group flying immediately behind, recognized the error. His navigator, who'd flown the June 42 Ploesti raid, tried warning him. Radio silence prevented communication with the lead group. Baker made a decision. He broke his group away and turned northwest toward the actual target. Behind him, the remaining groups saw the confusion. Some followed Baker. Others followed the lead group. The careful plan, practiced for weeks, rehearsed until every crew knew their position and timing, dissolved into chaos. And with radio silence broken by frantic calls, the Germans now knew exactly where the bombers were headed. Fighters were redirected to low altitude. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to battle stations. Smoke generators activated. The element of surprise, the foundation of Smart's entire plan, evaporated. Lieutenant Palm, flying Brewery Wagon, had been part of the 376th Lead Group. When they made the wrong turn at Targovist, Palm recognized the error. His navigator confirmed it. But by the time the mistake became obvious, the formation had scattered. Rather than follow the group southeast, Palm broke away and headed for Ploesti alone. One B-24, isolated, became the target of every gun below. The flak hit them first. A direct hit on the plexiglass nose killed Bombardier Merrill instantly and fatally wounded Navigator Wright. The cockpit filled with smoke and shattered plexiglass. One engine stopped, shrapnel tearing through its cowling. Two others caught fire, trailing black smoke. Palm fought to maintain control. The refinery smokestacks loomed ahead, massive towers that would shred the bomber if he hit them. He banked hard, the huge aircraft wallowing through the turn, narrowly missing the stacks. They'd reached the target area but could no longer make a proper bombing run. Palm hit the emergency bomb release, jettisoning their load over an empty area west of the city. Without the weight of bombs and most of their fuel gone, maybe they could fight their way home. That's when Hauptmann Wilhelm Steinmann found them. Commander of the 1st Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 4, Steinmann was flying a Bf-109 G6, armed with a 20mm cannon and twin machine guns. He saw the smoking Liberator and attacked from the rear, his cannon shells and machine gun fire ripping into the bomber's tail and fuselage. He pulled up and over, rolled, came back for a head-on pass. The Bf-109 was one of Germany's most successful fighters, continuously improved since the Spanish Civil War. The G6 version weighed 7,000 pounds, cruised at 350 miles per hour, and could hit 400 in a dive. It was nimble, responsive, deadly. Against a damaged, lumbering B-24 at low altitude, it was a wolf attacking a wounded buffalo. Steinmann's second pass hit Brewery Wagon in the nose, right wing, and engines 3 and 4 on the right side. His 20mm shells exploded throughout the aircraft. One struck near Palm's seat, the blast severing his leg and blowing his foot off the rudder pedal. Co-pilot Love took shrapnel wounds. The No. 3 engine exploded, metal fragments puncturing the right wing. But somehow, impossibly, Palm kept the bomber flying. He leveled out, aiming for open farmland, knowing they were done. Flight engineer Alexander Rockingson helped fight the controls. The ground rushed up. Palm pulled back, bleeding out, and somehow put the crippled bomber down in a cornfield near Tartarani, south of Ploesti. Brewery Wagon was among the first B-24s shot down over Romania. 8 of the crew survived, including Palm. His war was over. Romanian troops arrived and took them prisoner. A German doctor amputated what remained of Palm's leg. He would spend the rest of the war in prison camps, but he survived. Behind Brewery Wagon, the rest of Operation Tidal Wave descended into a maelstrom. Baker, flying Hell's Wench with volunteer co-pilot Major John Gerstad, led his group toward their targets through a storm of fire. Approaching the target, his aircraft was hit by a large-caliber anti-aircraft shell, seriously damaged and set on fire. Baker kept flying, kept the formation together, leading his group through the inferno. The anti-aircraft fire was devastating. German 88mm guns opened up, their explosive shells creating black flowers of shrapnel in the air. The lighter guns joined in, 20mm and 37mm weapons firing directly at bombers now at eye level with the gunners. Romanian troops who were supposed to run for shelter instead stood their ground and fought. Hell's Wench took hits, but Baker maintained formation and bombed his target. The bomber was dying around him, fuel streaming from punctured tanks, control surfaces shot away. Baker broke formation to avoid a mid-air collision with bombers from the lead group, now arriving in the target area from the opposite direction. He attempted to gain altitude so that his crew could escape from the doomed aircraft by parachute, but despite his efforts, Hell's Wench crashed and exploded, killing Baker and the other 9 airmen aboard. The low altitude meant every detail was visible. Gunners on the ground could see American faces through cockpit windows. Aircrewmen could see Romanian soldiers loading weapons, could watch muzzle flashes from guns firing directly at them. Some anti-aircraft weapons were positioned in haystacks, mock buildings, even damaged railroad cars. They'd open fire at point-blank range as bombers flew past. The refineries themselves added to the chaos. Massive storage tanks held millions of gallons of petroleum products. When bombs hit them, they erupted like volcanoes, sending burning oil hundreds of feet into the air. Cracking plants exploded with such force that shockwaves buffeted bombers a mile away. The delayed action fuses, intended to allow bombers to escape before bombs detonated, sometimes malfunctioned. Aircraft were destroyed by their own weapons exploding beneath them. And through it all, the German and Romanian fighters struck. The Bf-109s had been designed for high-altitude interception, but they adapted quickly to low-level combat. They dove out of the sun, made slashing attack runs, climbed away before defensive gunners could respond. At 200 feet, the fighters had all the advantages. They could maneuver freely while the heavy bombers wallowed, could attack from angles the turrets couldn't cover, could break off and dive for the ground if they took damage. For the B-24 gunners, combat at low altitude meant targets everywhere and nowhere. A fighter could appear from any angle, make a 3-second attack run, and be gone before a gunner could traverse his turret. The ball turret gunner, usually the most effective defensive position, was nearly useless at low altitude. Many crews had retracted the ball turret for the mission, leaving the underside of their aircraft vulnerable. The waist gunners stood at open windows, fighting gale force winds, temperature extremes, the deafening roar of engines and gunfire. They manned 50 caliber M2 Brownings, weapons that fired 850 rounds per minute. But at the speeds and altitudes they were fighting, a gunner might have 2 seconds to acquire a target, aim, and fire before the target was gone. Lieutenant Colonel Kane's 98th Group arrived over their assigned targets to find the refineries already burning from earlier strikes. Smoke obscured everything. Kane led his bombers through the inferno anyway, bombing through the smoke, accepting that they couldn't aim precisely but refusing to abort. His group destroyed both their assigned targets, the Columbia Aquila and Credital Minia refineries. But they paid. 11 of his 37 bombers went down. Nearly a third of his force. The entire raid lasted about 18 minutes over the targets. 18 minutes of violence so concentrated that men who survived said they lived a lifetime in that span. Then came the escape, and for many, that was worse than the attack. The scattered formations regrouped as best they could. Aircraft with dead or wounded pilots, engines shot out, controls damaged, struggled to stay airborne. German and Romanian fighters pursued them, knowing the bombers were vulnerable, wounded, low on ammunition. Some B-24s made it to neutral Turkey and landed at Turkish airfields. The crews were interned for the duration of the war, but they survived. Others, shot up beyond ability to reach friendly territory, turned back and crash-landed in Romania or Bulgaria. Some ditched in the Mediterranean. A few reached Cyprus or Malta. Many just disappeared, shot down over the Balkans or lost at sea. If you found this deep dive into verified history compelling, consider hitting the subscribe button. Understanding these sacrifices means honoring them with truth, not fiction. The bombers that made it back to Benghazi landed throughout the evening and into the next morning. Ground crews stood on the tarmac counting. 1, 2, 10, 20, 50. The numbers stopped climbing. 88 Liberators returned to base. Some barely flying, held together by luck and the determination of their crews. 53 were gone forever. The losses were catastrophic by any measure. 310 airmen were killed or missing, 108 were captured, and another 78 were interned in Turkey. It was proportionally the most costly major Allied air raid of the war. Nearly 30% of the attacking force destroyed. The date became known as Black Sunday. The men who survived told stories that seemed impossible. Bombers flying through walls of fire. Aircraft colliding with smokestacks and somehow staying airborne. Crews fighting their way home on 2 engines, 1 engine, returning with dead and wounded aboard, hydraulics shot out, controls barely responding. The immediate assessments were optimistic. Reconnaissance flights over Ploesti photographed massive destruction. Refineries burned for days. Storage tanks had exploded. Cracking towers collapsed. Initial reports claimed 40% of refining capacity destroyed. Intelligence officers told crews their sacrifice had shortened the war by months, maybe more. The men wanted to believe it. But the optimism was misplaced. General Alfred Gerstenberg acknowledged the damage but noted it would not appreciably diminish the supply of fuel to Germany and its allies. He understood what the Americans didn't. The refineries were interconnected. Undamaged facilities could compensate for destroyed ones. The Germans mobilized thousands of forced laborers. They worked around the clock repairing damage, rerouting pipelines, rebuilding critical infrastructure. Within weeks, most damage was repaired and output levels exceeded what they'd been before the raid. By September, enemy intelligence assessments concluded there was no curtailment of overall product output. The only refineries that remained offline for extended periods were Credital Minia and Columbia Aquila, which were so thoroughly destroyed they couldn't restart until late 1944. But the other facilities simply increased production to compensate. The raid had failed strategically. Worse, it had taught the Germans exactly how vulnerable Ploesti was. Gerstenberg, already paranoid about air defense, became obsessive. He doubled the anti-aircraft guns, added more radar, brought in additional fighter squadrons, deployed hundreds more smoke generators, built elaborate dummy facilities to confuse bombers. By the time Allied forces were ready to strike again, Ploesti had transformed from one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe to an absolute fortress. The human cost was staggering beyond the immediate losses. The captured airman faced years in German prison camps. Lieutenant Palm, recovering from his amputation in a Romanian hospital, was eventually moved to a prison camp where he spent the remainder of the war. The men interned in Turkey were technically prisoners, unable to fight, unable to go home, stuck in limbo until war's end. For the survivors who made it back, the psychological toll was immense. They'd watched friends die, seen bombers explode mid-air, disintegrate on impact with the ground, burn with crews trapped inside. Some never flew combat again, transferred to training duties or administrative positions. Others climbed back into B-24s the next week and continued flying missions, carrying their trauma in silence. But the raid also revealed something profound about the nature of air warfare. The low-altitude attack concept, revolutionary as it seemed, had proven catastrophically flawed against a prepared, well-defended target. The advantages Colonel Smart had envisioned, the speed and shock that would overwhelm defenses, only worked if you achieved complete surprise. The moment defenders knew you were coming, low altitude became a death trap. At high altitude, bombers had options. They could take evasive action, use clouds for cover, rely on their defensive armament to hold off fighters. At low altitude, flying straight and level toward a target, they were helpless. Every gun could hit them. Fighters could attack from any angle. A single burst of cannon fire could be fatal. There was no time to bail out, no altitude to trade for survival. The lessons were written in blood, but they were learned. When the Allies returned to Ploesti, they would do so differently. The strategic situation shifted dramatically in late 1943 when Allied forces captured airfields around Foggia in southern Italy. Suddenly Ploesti was within reach of a different kind of air campaign. The newly created 15th Air Force, based in Italy, could reach the Romanian refineries with heavy bombers escorted the entire way by P-51 Mustang fighters. The distance was half what it had been from Libya. In April 1944, nearly a year after Black Sunday, American bombers returned to Ploesti. This time they came at high altitude, 25,000 feet and above, in formations of hundreds of aircraft. It was a systematic campaign, not a single desperate strike. The 15th Air Force flew more than 20 daylight high-altitude missions against the oil fields, while Royal Air Force Wellington bombers conducted nighttime raids. The defenses were ferocious. Gerstenberg had used the intervening months well. Over 200 anti-aircraft guns ringed the refineries, with hundreds more fighters within range. But the Americans had advantages that hadn't existed in August 43. Fighter escorts meant German interceptors faced a battle every time they tried to attack bombers. High altitude meant anti-aircraft guns had to track formations for minutes, giving bombers time to take evasive action. And most critically, this was a campaign, not a raid. The Allies could afford losses, could return again and again, grinding down both the refineries and their defenses. The campaign was costly, with over 230 15th Air Force aircraft lost to Ploesti's defenses. But it worked. Each raid damaged facilities that couldn't be fully repaired before the next attack arrived. The Germans struggled to maintain fighter strength as the Luftwaffe lost pilots and aircraft in battles with American P-51s. By August 1944, the refineries were ruins. When Romania capitulated, Allied researchers found output was only 10% of what it had been 5 months earlier. The systematic high-altitude campaign had accomplished what Operation Tidal Wave could not. But it had required months of sustained effort, hundreds of missions, thousands of sorties. There were no shortcuts, no single decisive blow. The strategic implications rippled through the German war machine. Without Romanian oil, the Wehrmacht faced critical fuel shortages. Tanks sat idle. Fighter training was curtailed because there wasn't fuel for practice flights. Luftwaffe squadrons operated at reduced capacity. The synthetic fuel plants in Germany couldn't compensate for Ploesti's loss. By the war's end, German forces were literally running dry. But what about the original question? What happened when B-24s battled Bf-109s at low altitude? The answer was written across the skies of Romania on August 1, 1943. Heavy bombers, designed for high-altitude strategic warfare, could technically fight at ground level. But the cost was catastrophic. The advantages they possessed at altitude, their defensive armament, their ability to absorb damage, their formation tactics, all became liabilities when flying at rooftop height. The Bf-109, in contrast, was in its element. Fast, nimble, armed with cannon that could tear a bomber apart. The German fighter could attack from any angle and break away before defensive guns could respond. At low altitude, the equation of bomber versus fighter shifted catastrophically in favor of the fighter. Yet the B-24 crews had proven something else entirely. They'd proven that American airmen would fly missions even when those missions violated every principle of sound tactics. They'd proven they could maintain formation and discipline under conditions of unimaginable violence. They'd proven that courage, while not sufficient to guarantee success, was necessary for attempting the impossible. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded for Operation Tidal Wave, the most ever for a single air action. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker and Major John Gerstad received theirs posthumously for leading the 93rd Group through the Inferno. Colonel Leon Johnson and Colonel John Kane received theirs for leadership under fire, bringing their groups home despite catastrophic losses. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes received his posthumously for pressing home his attack in a bomber already on fire, knowing he would die but refusing to abandon his mission. 56 Distinguished Service Crosses. Hundreds of other decorations. The men of Operation Tidal Wave were among the most highly decorated in Air Force history. The awards recognized what the mission had revealed about human endurance, about the capacity of men to function under conditions that should have broken them. Lieutenant John Palm spent the rest of the war in prison camps. His leg was gone, his bomber destroyed, his navigator dead. But he'd gotten his crew down safely, saved the men who depended on him. After repatriation in 1945, he defied expectations by learning to fly again despite his prosthetic leg. He became a successful businessman, piloted his own aircraft for decades, lived until 1993. He rarely spoke about Ploesti, but when he did, he focused on the men who didn't come home. The B-24 Liberator itself emerged from Ploesti with a mixed reputation. The aircraft had proven it could fight at low altitude, could absorb tremendous punishment, could be flown by sheer determination when mechanical advantage was gone. But it had also revealed its vulnerabilities. The fuel system fires that claimed so many bombers led to improved self-sealing tanks in later models. The defensive armament was upgraded. Training emphasized formation integrity even more strongly. More broadly, Operation Tidal Wave forced a complete reassessment of American strategic bombing doctrine. The raid proved that single, massive strikes against heavily defended targets were not sufficient. Strategic bombing required sustained campaigns, fighter escort, the ability to absorb losses and continue operations. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, post-war analysis examined Ploesti's role in the defeat. The refineries, once producing millions of tons of fuel annually, had been reduced to rubble. The initial raid had failed, but the sustained campaign that followed had succeeded. Together, the missions cost over 300 Allied aircraft and thousands of casualties. But they'd severed a critical artery of German military power. The survivors of Operation Tidal Wave carried Ploesti with them for the rest of their lives. Some processed their trauma through writing, producing memoirs that captured the visceral horror of low-altitude combat. Others never spoke of it, keeping those memories locked away. Reunions brought them together, aging men comparing recollections, honoring fallen friends, trying to make sense of what they'd endured. The mission entered popular culture as a symbol of both heroism and futility. The most costly air raid of the war. The mission that failed but whose participants exemplified courage beyond measure. How could a mission be simultaneously a tactical failure and a testament to human valor? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding that war rarely offers clean victories or simple lessons. Operation Tidal Wave was conceived in desperation, planned with inadequate intelligence, executed with devastating results. But the men who flew it did so knowing the risks, accepting them because that's what their duty required. They faced death at altitudes where a moment's hesitation meant falling from the sky. They watched friends die and kept flying. When B-24 Liberators battled Bf-109 fighters at low altitude over Romania, the result was carnage. The tactical equation favored the fighters overwhelmingly. But tactics aren't everything. The Americans learned, adapted, returned with a better approach and ultimately achieved their strategic objective. The cost was terrible. The lesson was essential. And the courage displayed that August day remained undimmed by the mission's failure. Standing on that Libyan airfield in August 1943, watching the Liberators return one by one, ground crews understood something that wouldn't make it into official reports. The men climbing down from those bombers weren't the same ones who'd taken off that morning. They'd aged years in hours. They'd seen industrial warfare at its most brutal, fought in conditions that should have been impossible, survived through luck and skill and stubborn refusal to quit. The Army Air Forces would go on to conduct thousands more missions before war's end. Larger raids, more aircraft, greater destruction. But none would match the concentrated horror of those 18 minutes over Ploesti. None would test the limits of human endurance quite so severely. And none would demonstrate quite so clearly what happened when doctrine collided with reality, when planning met chaos, when courage faced overwhelming odds. The raid was one of the only airstrikes of the war in which more airmen were killed than civilians, with 116 Romanian civilians and military personnel killed. The violence had been focused, industrial, mechanized. Two air forces fighting a battle that looked more like mechanized slaughter than aerial combat. The men who flew to Ploesti deserve to be remembered accurately, their courage honored with facts, not myths. If this deep dive into verified World War II history resonated with you, please subscribe. Every story here is researched, every detail confirmed, because the truth of their sacrifice demands nothing less. The question posed by the title has been answered. B-24 Liberators battled Messerschmitt Bf-109s at low altitude, and the result was Black Sunday. A day when doctrine failed, when planning collapsed, when courage alone couldn't overcome tactical impossibility. But also a day when American airmen proved they would attempt the impossible, fly missions that violated every principle of sound operations, die if necessary to accomplish their objectives. Lieutenant Palm, recovering in a hospital with his leg amputated, probably understood this better than the planners in Washington who'd conceived the mission. He'd flown Brewery Wagon into hell, fought the controls with a severed leg, brought his crew home. The mission had failed, but the men hadn't. They'd done what was asked of them, faced what they had to face, survived when survival seemed impossible. That was the real legacy of Operation Tidal Wave. Not the destroyed refineries, which were repaired within weeks. Not the strategic impact, which was negligible until the sustained campaign of 1944. But the demonstration of what American airmen could endure. The proof that courage, while not sufficient for victory, was necessary for attempting the extraordinary. The evidence that heavy bombers could fight at any altitude, under any conditions, if the men flying them refused to quit. When the B-24s battled Bf-109s at low altitude, they lost. But they fought. And sometimes, in war, fighting is all you can do.